video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can check them out this weekend for awesome Black Friday deals and more. Go to cardkingdom.com for all kinds of Magic products. Hello everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. This week we're looking at Hybrid Mana, a mechanic that lets you pay one of two types of mana for a mana cost. Hybrid Mana is more common on planes where there are guilds or other specific groups associated with different kinds of mana. Fittingly, we have seen Hybrid Mana every time we've gone to the plane of Ravnica, and as a result, there are a lot of cards with Hybrid Mana costs that are legal in Standard right now. It also appeared in Shadowmoor Block, Alara Reborn, and Fate Reforged. In all, there are 347 cards that were eligible for this list. In this video, we'll talk about the 10 cards with Hybrid Mana costs, or hybrid costs in their text box, that have made the biggest impact on Magic's competitive scene. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score these lists. Pro Tour Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. At number 10, we have the only card on the list from Return to Ravnica, and that's Judge's Familiar. Between being a reasonably costed evasive creature and having the ability to make your opponent wait a little longer to cast important spells, like board sweepers, Judge's Familiar is the kind of card that is right at home in an aggro deck. In general, Hybrid Mana increases the playability of cards too, since so many different color combinations are capable of playing the card. In Return to Ravnica Block, for example, it picked up a top 8 in a Selesnya aggro deck. In Standard, it was mostly featured in Devotion to blue decks. That's a continuing theme that we're going to see on this list too. Cards printed in Return to Ravnica Block with Hybrid Mana fit very nicely into Devotion decks that were big in Standard, but more on that later. The Familiar picked up its first point in Modern earlier this year at Grand Prix Las Vegas, where it was in a Creatures Toolbox deck, basically a deck that runs Collected Company and Court of Calling and can search up specific cards depending on what's going on in the game. The Familiar is particularly nasty to search up at instant speed when it can just be a counterspell. The top 8 could be a sign of more to come in Modern for the Familiar. At number 9, we have the first of 2 cards on the list from Fate Reforged, and both of them have Hybrid Mana in their text box instead of as their casting cost. The first of these is Warden of the First Tree. While a 1 mana 1/1 is nothing special, the fact that this can get progressively larger and scarier is awesome. This is the kind of creature you like to run because if things aren't going the right way, you can always put mana into it. For example, if you really want to play a 2-drop but don't have one, you can always use the first ability. And if you flood out late, well, you can use the other 2 abilities in the mid to late game. Warden of the First Tree was a part of the deck that was arguably the most dominant during Khans Block Standard, Abzan midrange, where it could be played alongside other powerful cards like Siege Rhino and Wingmate Rock. It also saw a bit of play in decks like Selesnya aggro and Bant aggro. It hasn't seen play since rotating out of Standard, and it doesn't seem like a super likely candidate to do so, so it is probably going to fall off this list in the next year. At number 8, we have a creature that has made it on back-to-back top 10s, Boros Reckoner, who also appeared on last week's video on First Strike. The Reckoner provides a serious beating for your opponent. While the efficient stats and ability to gain First Strike are nice, what really pushes the Reckoner over is the fact that anytime it gets damaged, you can make it go after a creature or player for the same amount of damage. This means you can't really trade with it in combat effectively, or use any spells that do damage to it, since those types of things will usually result in a 2-for-1. So that means, until you get a removal spell for him, he's just going to be hitting you for damage. Boros Reckoner's resume was further boosted by the coming of Theros Block, where the fact that its mana cost provided 3 devotion to both red and white made it a nice inclusion in a Standard where devotion was the dominant theme. Before devotion came along, it did see play in decks like Gruul aggro and Naya aggro, and after devotion came along, it found itself shoved in decks with a wide variety of color combinations. This included devotion to Gruul, devotion to Boros, and devotion to red. Despite all the value he can give you, the Reckoner isn't quite good enough to see play in non-rotating formats, and I don't think that it will in the future. At number 7, we have our first card from Shadowmoor, Murderous Redcap. Murderous Redcap, even in a vacuum, is a good card. A 4-mana 2/2 that can do 2 to something, and then because of Persist, when it dies, it can do an additional 1 to something, is some great value. It could potentially provide you with a 3-for-1 or even a 4-for-1. In Standard, it mostly saw play in decks that were just interested in a card that could do good stuff on its own. It saw play in decks like Doran the Siege Tower, Fairies, and Black-White tokens. Murderous Redcap really started to get abused in Modern in 2011 after the printing of Birthing Pod. Murderous Redcap was good in the deck, not just because it could be sacrificed twice to the pod and give you some serious value in doing so, but also because it was part of the instant win combo the pod deck wanted to assemble. It involved a creature with Persist, like the Redcap, and Melira Sylvok Outcast, and a sacrifice outlet, and that let you do infinite damage to your opponent with the Redcap. Combos that take 3 cards usually aren't that good in Constructed, but when combined with Birthing Pod, this deck was incredibly consistent, so much so that eventually Birthing Pod got banned out of Modern. The successors of Birthing Pod decks instead use Court of Calving or Collected Company to try to assemble combos, and Murderous Redcap saw play in modern decks like that in 2015 and 2016, but it hasn't managed a top 8 in any format in about 2 years, so the banning of Birthing Pod may have permanently benched Murderous Redcap. At number 6, we have a card that has a really cool design as far as hybrid cards go, and that's Firespout. There are several cards with similar designs in Shadowmoor, where you get an extra bonus should you be playing this in a deck that can produce both red and green mana, instead of a deck that can only produce one or the other. In a red-green deck, a 3 mana do 3 to everything is quite powerful. Even if you're only getting the 3 damage to ground creatures part, we're still looking at a pretty powerful card. Because it is such an efficient sweeper, Firespout has seen play across all 6 formats that it is possible to get points from in these videos. Obviously, this is the kind of card that control decks are the most interested in running. It saw a fair bit of play in block and standard in various control decks. It saw play in extended too, in control decks like Tezzerator, but also in combo decks like Hypergenesis and Scapeshift, where it could be used to buy you time that you needed to combo off against an aggressive deck. In Modern, it saw play in Splinter Twin decks before that got banned. These days, its primary home is Bloomless Titan and Scapeshift, both which try to win the game in a single turn, so buying more time with Firespout is pretty nice. It has also seen play in legacy combo decks like Sneak and Show and Painter. It even has one Vintage Championship top 8 appearing in an Oath of Druids combo deck. At number 5, we have another creature from Gatecrash whose mana cost involves 3 hybrid symbols, and that is Nightveil Spectre. It is pretty similar to Boros Reckoner in that it is a strong card all on its own. A 3 mana 2/3 of flying that draws you a card every time you hit your opponent is pretty powerful. Also, like the Reckoner, it thrived in the Devotion-heavy Theros standard and put up all of its points in either Devotion to Blue or Devotion to Black decks. The Spectre has never seen play since rotating out of standard though, and I don't think it's very likely that it will. At number 4, we have a creature who costs hybrid mana and that can blow up lands, and that's Fulminator Mage. It actually didn't do a whole lot in standard or block of its time, gaining only 3 points between the 2 formats. It also only picked up 1 Grand Prix top 8 and extended in 2010 in a Living In deck, where you basically got to blow up 2 of your opponent's lands with a single Fulminator Mage. Modern is where it has done the most work though, as there are non-basic lands everywhere. It first debuted in the format in Birthing Pod decks, which are capable of searching up the mage when blowing up a land is particularly advantageous, and has seen play in the modern version of Living In, but it's seen the most play in Jund. More recently, it's begun to see play in decks packing Collected Company, as it is a nice card to hit off of Collected Company, and it has a home in the sideboard right now of Death Shadow Zoo decks. It will only build on its lead on the other cards in this list, since it still sees such consistent play in Modern. At number 3, we have the second and final card on the list with hybrid mana in its text box, and this one is Tasigur the Golden Fang, the leader of the Sultai. Delve ended up being a pretty silly mechanic. Decks could just play a lot of cheap spells or ways to fill the graveyard and power out something like Tasigur for 3 or 4 mana, or even less. So you usually ended up getting a great deal on a 4/5 creature even without his ability. But his ability allows you to continue to stock your graveyard and draws you cards, both of which are quite nice. The strongest cards with Delve have seen play across multiple formats, since they only get better the more cheap spells and ways to fill your graveyard that are available to you. It was a heavily played card in Standard, where it appeared alongside fellow hybrid mana creature, Warden of the First Tree, and Abzan decks. It was also played in the graveyard-centric Sultai Whip deck and in various Dragon control decks. Modern is where it is still seeing play. When it was first released, it was seeing play in decks like Abzan, Jund, and Junk. More recently, it has seen play in Grixis Delver, Death Shadow Zoo, and Hollow One. All 3 of those are decks that can quickly load up the graveyard. In Legacy, Tasigur saw play in Delver and 4-color control decks between 2015 and 2017. He hasn't continued to see play there, where Karakas is essentially a staple, and it can make Tasigur feel pretty awful. But still, it sees enough play in Modern that its spot on this list is safe, and he may even have a chance at catching the cards in front of it. At number 2, we have a card that has come in at 2 on 3 other lists and has yet to manage a number 1, and that's Deathrite Shaman, a card so powerful that it has been banned in more than one format. Deathrite Shaman is effectively a mana dork who can function as a win condition thanks to his other abilities. Some jokingly refer to him as a 1-mana planeswalker because he has 3 different abilities he can use, kind of like a planeswalker. And yeah, you need a land in a graveyard for him to produce mana, but that's not too hard in formats with fetch lands. It made Jund decks incredibly powerful in multiple formats, and it was also great in any deck that loaded its graveyard like various Reanimator strategies. In Modern, it made Jund so good that it eventually got the ban hammer in 2014, and in Legacy it got hit with the hammer earlier this year simply because it was played in a preponderance of decks, including 4-color control, various Delver and Threshold incarnations, and so on. As an example, at the last Legacy Grand Prix where it was legal, it was in 6 of the top 8 decks. Now that it's banned in both Modern and Standard, its position on the list may be vulnerable, as it isn't seeing much play in Vintage right now. Tasigur is right behind him. And at number 1, we have another creature who loves Birthing Pod, Kitchen Finks. Like the red cap, Kitchen Finks is pretty darn good on its own, providing you a total of 4 life, and a 3/2 and a 2/1 body, all for only 3 mana. That's the kind of value that can drive an aggro deck insane, since you can trade with 2 different things with the Finks while also gaining life. It saw play in Block, Standard, and Extended simply on the basis of being a good card all on its own. But like the red cap, it got truly absurd in Modern once Birthing Pod was printed. It helped you make the combo more consistent, since if you ran both the Finks and the red cap, you had 2 different combos, either infinite damage or infinite life. Unlike the red cap though, Kitchen Finks has seen play and continues to see play in more than just Birthing Pod decks, which has allowed it to continue to see play even after the pod got banned. While it sees play in the Creature's Toolbox deck, it can also be found in decks like Jund, Elves, Infect, and Hate Bear in Modern. Its spot at number 1 on this list seems fairly secure since it is still seeing so much play. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos. Thanks for watching.